The arts remain one of the best ways to preserve culture in a way that people can actually interact with. Literature, folk music and art, among many others, allow us to experience culture, even secondhand, using tangible sources. And even better, we can then create our own responses to this culture using our chosen cultural medium. Painter Ralph Hedley captured ordinary working class life around Tyneside and Northumberland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in this episode of Fabulous Folklore, we're going to explore how he captured scenes of ritual, tradition and custom in his beautiful paintings and investigate what they can tell us about the way folklore shows up primarily in cities. But we're also focusing on his work as an example of how much community rituals mattered in the past as a way of bringing people together, and I think we need that now more than ever. So let's go and explore the work of Ralph Hedley. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well, and as ever, I do mean that sincerely. I do genuinely hope that you're well. I hope that you are getting involved with your community and so on, because we are going to be having quite a community-focused episode, in the sense that we're looking at the work of a painter who depicted things that were going on in a community, if we consider that community to be a region, which I hope will be quite interesting. If you are listening to the audio version, then I would recommend going to the blog post that is linked in the show notes so you can see the images of the paintings that I'm talking about. If on the other hand you're on YouTube, then obviously the images will be on the screen, making life a lot easier for you. While I did say in an earlier episode that it is difficult for me to cover any kind of political content because of the fact that I record in advance, it would of course be remiss of me not to mention the latest horror show coming out of Minnesota, and to express my support and solidarity with the people of Minnesota with the situation that you're facing right now. And I have also posted a link in the show notes for an organisation who's handling mutual aid in Minnesota. So hopefully if that is something that you can help with, then the link is there for you to do so. But I also recognise that people do need a breather from being addicted to the news cycle. So we're going to have a look quickly at who Ralph Hedley was before we get into his artwork. And you will see from his biography, I think, one of many reasons why I've chosen him. But who was he, I hear you ask? Because he's not very well known outside of the Northeast. And he was born on the 31st of December 1848 near Richmond in North Yorkshire. And he moved to Newcastle in around about 1850 with his parents. The main reason was because his father was a jobbing carpenter. And because of the industrial expansion along the River Tyne at the time, it became quite clear that the best place to find jobs were going to be in these rapidly industrialising areas, and his father did become a builder on Tyneside, so clearly it was a good move for them. Ralph obviously ended up following sort of in his father's footsteps, but rather than becoming a carpenter specifically, by about 13 he'd become a carving apprentice, but he was also studying art and design under pre-Raphaelite William Bell Scott, who was in Newcastle at the time. Hedley became a successful woodcarver, although he also branched into lithography for the press and painted as often as he could, and the Royal Academy actually accepted his painting The Newsboy for exhibition in 1879, which was actually the first of many. He had lots of paintings accepted by them, and at one point I think he had something like 5 on display at the same time, which is pretty cool. In 1882, he won the contract to craft the choir stalls and rood screen at St Nicholas's Cathedral, and he took inspiration from the early 15th century designs at Carlisle Cathedral. So this particular gorgeous wyvern and 2 griffins make him an excellent artist to feature here at Fabulous Folklore, especially given my own love of both dragons and griffins. And if you're in the cathedral and wonder where you can find these beautiful carvings, they are the Missouri cords, which are up in the choir. So they're like the little seats that you could basically perch on if you were either infirm or unwell or had some kind of disability and you were in the choir. You could look like you were still standing, but you had something to support you. And when they're flipped up over, you can then see the carvings on the bottom. If that wasn't enough for Hedley, though, he also founded the Buick Club with Henry Hetherington Emerson and Robert Jobling to exhibit local artists' work. The main reason they did so was because there basically weren't any opportunities to exhibit work in the Northeast, particularly as a local artist. So the London-centric nature of the art world hasn't really changed that much, and they eventually ended up having to form this club to show people in the Northeast that there was actually local talent. The Buick Club staged their first exhibition in 1884, and they did manage to overcome the lack of opportunities for artists without powerful patrons, because that was the other problem, the fact that if you came from a background a little bit like Hedley's, you weren't going to have a really rich and famous patron who was then going to pay you to do your work. Hedley died on 14th of June 1913, and the Newcastle Daily Chronicle described him thus, and I quote, "What Burns did for the peasantry of Scotland with his pen, Ralph Hedley with his brush and palette had done for the Northumberland miner and labouring man," end quote. And the newspaper seemed genuinely quite saddened by his death from kidney disease. So among many images that we're going to have a look at in a minute, he painted such works as Laston Market in 1885, depicting a small boy asleep in the cart that brought him to market, and obviously a boy such as this would have helped sell produce before returning home to the countryside, and in this case the market was actually intended to be the big market. Or how about Going Home from 1888, which showed two miners walking home from Bladen Main Pit. Many of his subjects were ordinary workers in the middle of tasks, local dignitaries posing for perhaps their one shot at art-based immortality, or seasonal rituals that people understood as a rock in the continually flowing current of the year. Interestingly, his work was also concurrent with William Henderson's book about folklore in the northern half of the country, and he even took inspiration from customs included within it, and he was also concurrent with the foundation of the Folklore Society, so there was a real interest in folklore at the time that Hedley was working. I, of course, reference Henderson's book all the time on the podcast, and actually do so in this particular episode. So Hedley's basically a man after my own heart, and all of this work alongside folklore makes him an ideal case study for a folklore podcast keen to explore how art preserves folk rituals and traditions. So the first proper work that we're going to have a look at is Barge Day from 1891, and this painting, as you might imagine by the title, marks Barge Day, an annual procession along the River Tyne, usually held on Ascension Day, which falls on a Thursday 40 days after Easter, so in 2026 that's 14th of May. The parade asserted Newcastle Corporation's rights over the river between headwind streams near Newburn and the North Sea. It was essentially a beating the bounds ritual, except it was held on water, and such rituals were commonly held to mark the boundaries of a parish, reinforcing their power or jurisdiction. So the Barge Day custom began in the 16th century and lasted until 1901, and it caused quite a lot of friction between Newcastle and North Shields over their legal control of the Tyne, particularly at that point where North Shields is. Barge Day featured parades, rowing contests and other celebrations, and some of these were held on Kingsmeadow Island, which was dredged away during improvement work to the river. And we did talk about this briefly when I covered the Bladen races a few weeks ago, and how Kingsmeadow Island lay between Elsick on the north bank of the Tyne and Dunstan on the south bank, if you're trying to place where on earth an island would be in the middle of the river, because it's really difficult to imagine it now. But Hedley painted this particular painting in 1891 after travelling as a guest of the corporation during Barge Day. He actually travelled on the steamship Mabel, but the painting depicts the Lord Mayor's barge instead. And without the painting, it would actually be quite easy to forget the custom ever existed. And if you do look Barge Day up, there's only really two paintings that ever show up, and it's this one and one by Wilson Heppel from the 18th century. So I didn't even know anything about Barge Day until I started looking through Hedley's work. So it just goes to show that examining the work of a local painter can be a really good way to uncover customs that people just forgot ever existed. Our next example of a painting is Paddy's Clothes Market, Sandgate from 1898, and this clothes market was held on Saturday mornings in the Milk Market beside the quayside, and that's in the Sandgate area. And I know it's spelled Sandgate, but we pronounce it Sandgate. And in the 1830s, people might lay old clothes out on straw, and essentially they would offer them for sale. Over time, they dispensed with the straw and began laying clothes on tables or directly on the pavement. And even in the 1960s, people might sell old clothes from upturned crates. My mother remembered it, and she also remembered that some people would actually put clothes on hangers and hang them off the railings that went up the back of the milk market. So people had different ways of displaying their wares. Now, people repurposed the phrase Paddy's Market to describe chaotic or untidy situations, And a British soldier writing to the Evening Chronicle in 1915 actually used the phrase to describe the First World War front line. And while Glasgow, Ashington, Stanley and Chesterley Street also had Paddy's markets, the Newcastle one remained in the Sandgate area. And here's an example of it from around about 1900. David Morton at the Chronicle describes how it was quite difficult to know exactly when the market started, but the general belief is that it began in the early Victorian era. Mine owners brought Irish miners to Newcastle to break a strike, and they then moved into the very cheap tenements on the quayside, and Paddy's Market then became the place that they bought clothes. My mum actually remembers going to have a look at the clothes in the 1950s, and she sort of said that obviously the types of clothes that were available basically depended on what it was people had to sell, because this is clearly an era before fast fashion. So if you had clothing that wasn't completely worn out and had a little bit of life in it, but maybe you'd grown out of it or had no use for it anymore, then selling it on was the ideal way to make a bit of money. And that basically then just meant that clothing stayed in circulation a lot longer than it does now. Over time, the market fell out of use and tailed off during the 1970s, and the quayside does still host markets today, although they sell a range of goods from photographic prints to locally produced food items to handmade jewellery or knitwear, all very different. Our next image isn't Tyneside, it is actually Northumberland, but it is only 17 miles to the west of Newcastle, and it really does depict a moment that would be quite important in the calendar in that particular area, so I thought I would include it anyway. And this is Proclaiming Stagshaw Fair at Corbridge 1882. And in the 19th century in particular, Stagshaw Bank Common hosted great fairs that apparently lasted for around a week or so, and the common nestled at the junction between Hadrian's Wall and the Roman Deer Street. So this particular painting depicts the announcement of the fair in nearby Corbridge, which as I say is about 17 miles west of Newcastle. So the fair on the 6th of May sold sheep and cattle. There was another one at Whitsun which sold cattle and horses. Another one on the 4th of July sold sheep, horses and cattle. And there was a 26th of September fair which sold sheep and cattle as well. Now these fairs were huge and attracted sellers from all over the UK. Over time they obviously evolved beyond selling just livestock, and they moved on to selling things like men's boots and hats, jewellery, farming equipment, cloth or barrels and tubs, among a range of other things. Writing in 1881, Robert Forster described the fair as it was in around about 1850, describing how the clamour of stallholders selling their wares, and I quote, often mingled with the roar of Wombwell's lions, end quote. And this refers to George Wombwell, who founded his travelling menagerie in the 19th century and then toured the fairs of Britain. And I thought this was really interesting because one of his lions, Nero, was then immortalised as a statue on his tomb in Highgate Cemetery, and I've always loved that particular tomb, so it was quite cool to see like a local link there. But Forster's descriptions sound absolutely epic of what this fair must have looked like, with all manner of vendors selling baked goods. I think he mentions gingerbread about 4 times, while entertainers would perform tricks and spectacles for attendees. It is difficult to know when the fair actually started, but then there are suggestions that they might have begun during the Roman occupation, which would make sense considering the fact that it's basically at the point where there was a gate through Hadrian's Wall, but the fair originally enjoyed its international reputation in the Middle Ages. It may have begun in that particular format, as I say, in the Middle Ages. Even in 1969, locals remembered the excitement and revelry of the fair, with a cottage at the edge of the common serving refreshments through a window, although it's been many, many years since anyone has actually had that particular fair now. So again, this is another painting which captures a bygone custom that, as I say, I'd never actually heard about until I went looking. I was like, oh, okay, this is actually a thing then. So again, Hedley has preserved the excitement of something for posterity, which is also what he's done with this painting, Barred Out, 29th of May from 1896. And this painting depicts a British custom in which children barred their teacher from the classroom on an agreed day. And in the case of this painting, the custom referred to the children dictating the terms of their holidays to the teacher. And this seems to be a common theme with barring out, with a writer in the Downham Market Gazette recalling the tradition in 1906, although the tradition had already ceased by the time he finished at school. And in this recollection, the schoolmaster went along with the ritual, leaving the classroom under the pretext that the neighbouring blacksmith wanted to see him, and while he was gone, the children barricaded the doors and wouldn't let him re-enter until they'd negotiated their holidays. The writer noted that despite threats of the cane, no one was ever actually punished, and he also noticed that the ceremony made no real difference because the holidays were already fixed beforehand. In a way, it almost sounds a little bit like the Lord of Misrule stuff that you get around Twelfth Night, of this idea of authority being inverted, so the people at the bottom of the power structure gaining power over the authority figure, albeit temporarily. And in this case, it's very much a symbolic thing rather than an actual thing. And an article in the Leicester Daily Post described the tradition likewise occurring at Christmas. So if the teacher failed to re-enter the classroom within 3 days, the students could claim special privileges once they returned in the new year, which again takes us back to that idea of the Lord of Misrule and the people at the bottom being able to set the terms. The writer of the piece in the Leicester Daily Post described their confusion at the teachers allowing the custom at all, but did suggest that the teachers, and I quote, tolerated it as a sort of legitimate piece of rough fun to be permitted as a special treat at Christmas time, end quote. And elsewhere, F. Harrison gave a lecture in Cumbria which included the topic, and he also remembered the tradition falling at Christmas, and he blamed the establishment of the school board system for the death of the custom. By comparison, William Henderson, who I mentioned at the beginning as writing the book that Hedley actually got inspired by, described the custom in Bromfield, Cumbria as falling at the start of Lent instead, and in this example the students barricaded themselves in the school and they kept the teachers out again for 3 days. If the teachers got back inside within the 3 days, they could impose extra tasks on the students, and if they didn't, the teacher then proposed new terms to the students, which would usually include things like what times would be set aside for study and what times were set aside for play, and the teacher and students would then sign the agreement. Henderson said it was a custom until the last 20 or 30 years, and given his book came out in 1879, that would mean it likely lasted until around 1850 or 1860. But again, Hedley has managed to capture it here. He specified a date of the 29th of May, so it could well be whichever school he happened to go to, that was the date that they had chosen, because it does wander around the calendar a little bit. For our next painting, Geordie Had the Bairn of 1890, we did look at this painting in the Joe Wilson episode when we explored how the Chronicle commissioned it to illustrate Joe Wilson's song I Wish Your Mother Would Come, but I wanted to return to it because it depicts a lost part of northeast working class culture that actually continued well into the 20th century, and yes, we are talking about the clippy mat. So I'm going to zoom in just so you can see the bit I'm talking about. But in the painting, the dog lies on a rug in front of the hearth, but this is no ordinary rug. It's a clippy mat, also known as a proggy mat or a hooky mat. The three names all kind of essentially mean the same thing, but people call them by different names depending on where they're from and what they're used to. And the mats were made by hooking or pushing scraps of fabric through a rectangle of Hessian mesh, so the two ends of the fabric provided the rug texture, and you could make up patterns by using coloured scraps in specific ways, or you could just use fabric of the same colour. The example in the painting has one colour around the outside as a border and then another colour in the middle. The three different names for the item come from the fact that you could hook or prog the fabric through, which is obviously hooking it or pushing it through, and then you would clip all the ends to make them all the same length, hence clippy mat. My dad does remember having a similar rug made of wool, and designs were printed onto the Hessian so you knew which colours to use where, but more commonly the mats did use fabric. My mother described them as still being popular in 1950s biker because rugs were far too expensive for the working class community, and she was saying how both my grandparents used to actually sit and make them, usually sitting in front of the fire, and there was an entire frame that they would actually put these things on in order to essentially get to the back of the mesh to push things through and so on. I've actually had a go at making one because we went to see them at Beamish Museum when I was in primary school, so we then got to make our own version. Obviously these were quite small, about the size of A5, and you got a sheet of mesh. You had a progging tool, which is basically a little bit like a pencil but without a lead, and then my mum had a selection of bits of fabric from things because she used to do dressmaking. So I used some of the scraps from what she hadn't used to make my own proggy mat. It will be somewhere in the loft, God knows where, but there is one somewhere. And it's quite an interesting concept because you get one end of the fabric and you push that through a gap in the mesh, and then you get the other side of the fabric and push that through like the neighbouring gap. So you then just had a little bit of the mesh in between, and once you pulled it tight it all kind of stays quite secure anyway, and then once you fill the mesh up it all sort of holds itself in place, which is quite clever. And to be honest with you, if you are interested in sustainability, recycling fabric or making your own homewares, clippy mats still offer a really useful way to reuse old fabric that might otherwise go to landfill. I also want to include the clippy mat because there have been various discussions online about the idea of England's culture. Do we have any? Have we lost it? Are we losing it because of this, that and the other? And put simply, I do think that we are losing bits of our culture, but not for the reason that some people will say. Some people will obviously blame immigration, which I think is nonsense, because other people moving to a place and taking their culture with them has been happening, well, ever since people have been moving around. So I don't really think that that is the case at all. What I do actually think has become part of the problem is the fact that something like the Clippy Mat shows how people were resourceful when they didn't have much money. Whereas nowadays, most people would just go to Home Bargains or B&M or IKEA and buy a rug. They wouldn't think to reuse old fabric and make their own because they don't financially need to. So I think part of it is a change in earning patterns, and also just the fact that a lot of people will just go and buy something rather than making it themselves. But there's also the additional factor that I think technology has also played quite a role in the loss of a lot of cultural customs, because of the fact that either people just no longer practice them because they are distracted by devices, but because of social media having such a homogenizing effect, people then aren't practicing regional culture because they're exposed to whatever the internet is doing, which means that people are being exposed to things from all over the place, which is great, but it does then mean that everything kind of gets flattened out into one level of whatever happens to be trending on a platform at that particular moment in time. So I think anyone who's complaining about a loss of culture or whatever needs to have a look at where the culture came from in the first place, where the customs came from in the first place, and then work out why that context has changed, and that's why that custom then no longer happens. So I think sometimes you do have to actually just look at something really basic like earning patterns and technology and access to the internet as potentially being the problem there, not immigration. So there we go. That's my little rant about Clippy Mats. If you want to have a go though, I'm not quite sure where you would get the Hessian mesh from now, but I dare say there's probably somewhere online you can actually buy it from. And they are a really good way to make something like a rug that's going to go at the front door that you're just going to wipe your feet on. And if you've got loads of old clothes that you don't know what to do with them, rather than them going into landfill, why not reuse it as a Clippy mat and then you've got something to wipe your shoes on. So there we go. Our second to last painting is the Ballad Cellar at the Black Gate from 1884. And I wanted to include this one because we have obviously talked about music quite a lot this month. And in the eras before recording music became possible, people would buy ballad sheets from street sellers. And these often contained the lyrics, while the sellers might teach them the tune to go with them. And some of the ballads would also reuse popular or well-known tunes, so you would know you could then just set the lyrics to a song you already knew. Folklorists might treat ballads as folk songs, but literary scholars often consider them as poetry. And they're not ballads in the sense that we would think of a ballad as like a power ballad or something like that, or sort of a romance song that might hit number one because it's Christmas or whatever. That's not what ballad means in this particular sense. And sometimes in the case of broadside ballads, they were used to tell news stories, and they would be sold on execution days to tell the tales of the condemned. And the plain dealer described ballads as, and I quote, direct descendants of the minstrelsy of medieval England, wretched doggerel, and a contribution to the history of our countryside, end quote. They could also be ballads about things from folklore and legend, so you get ballads about people like Thomas the Rhymer as well. Now, an article in the Newcastle Weekly Chronicle supplement in 1887, just 3 years after Hedley painted this painting, claimed that the ballad sellers and ballad singers were actually gradually dying out, and it seems that they were mostly found at country fairs at that point. And people were buying books of songs by music hall singers, making ballad sheets less popular. Articles as late as 1905 described ballad sellers as itinerant, suggesting a somewhat perilous form of income, and we can only imagine the uncertain financials of this ballad seller trying to make money outside the Black Gate. That was the original postern gate for the castle, which obviously we talked about last week, but in 1884 it was the entrance to the Castle Garth area, which had become a slum. The authorities offered various proposals to demolish it, but the Society of Antiquaries rescued the building in 1883. So in painting this, Hedley captures both the environs of the Black Gate and the irregular earnings of the ballad seller amid a dwindling trade, and she's displaying her wares on a temporary fence behind which building work takes place. And here Hedley's really displaying a Victorian concern for social conditions in the city. It is also important to remember that Hedley reached the middle class, but he was originally working class himself. After all, he was the son of a jobbing carpenter and builder before he essentially made good through his art and carving business. In a way, it's a really lovely painting, despite its subject matter, but I think it is also interesting the way that we can then compare that with photographs of the same area and realise how actually that maybe wasn't the most salubrious place to be selling your wares. Our final painting, though, is Blinking in the Sun from 1881, and there is absolutely no folklore associated with this painting at all. I literally just wanted to include it because it's gorgeous. And this is probably one of Hedley's most popular paintings, and it appears on a whole range of merchandise available in the Laying Art Gallery, from tote bags to cushions. It's beautiful, isn't it? And I wanted to include that just so that you've got all of this social commentary in these other paintings, and then you've got this one that's literally just a cat sitting at a window enjoying a sunny day. And I think this is also, again, it's a slice of life. The cat owners among you will be sitting there going, yeah, my cat does that. You might even have a cat that looks like this one. So yeah, you will be able to go, I recognise that scene. So then it was also one of Hedley's earlier paintings as well. It is obviously before a lot of the social realism comes in. But what do we make of Ralph Hedley and his work? Well, I think the newspapers of the day capture his importance to the region in the obituaries they published, and they do actually seem genuinely sad to bring news of his death, praising his evident talent as a painter, but then also preserving the way that he preserved ordinary scenes from the local area. As a realist, he sought to paint these familiar scenes, whether that was tradespeople at work, markets and fairs, or even cheeky customs like barring out. And I think people appreciated his work because they saw something of themselves in it. And obviously when you consider what the pre-Raphaelites were painting, and you've got people like John William Waterhouse, who, don't forget, I love his work and there's an episode on him, but he's painting the likes of the Lady of Shalott and scenes from Greek mythology and so on. You can't really see yourself in that necessarily, but you could potentially see yourself in any one of Hedley's paintings, particularly if you lived locally. But we can also appreciate his work now for what his work tells us of the lives of people often overlooked by the history books and the customs that fell away as the 20th century rolled around. It's interesting how the Chronicle compared him to Burns for capturing the lives of ordinary people, and this is what we also saw with Joe Wilson. He was capturing slices of life involving a class that historically were overlooked when people were writing down histories of a time and place. And Hedley's basically done the same thing, but in a visual format, which is cool. And as a folklorist, I thank him for capturing those details. It is very helpful. And who knows, perhaps seeing these scenes so beautifully rendered might inspire us to resurrect old customs or investigate our own forgotten culture. So on that note, who fancies making a clippy mat? I hope you've enjoyed this episode, getting to know Ralph Hedley's work. I really like him. And there was a whole exhibition of his work in about 1990 where they literally just labelled him Tyneside Painter. And it almost didn't happen because of financial issues. And then a bunch of local businesses, including Greg's, which made me laugh, essentially stepped up and helped make sure that the exhibition could actually happen, which is also really cool how a community can, and indeed maybe should, look after itself in the face of competition with others, but also just simply if the community doesn't look after itself, who will look after it for them is probably the idea. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at some art today. Next week we're going to go on to children's folklore for February, and as ever I do have my Google form in the show notes, so if you want to share any children's folklore, and that is basically either things you remember from when you were a kid. So maybe there was a particular house that you always avoided because one of you said that a witch lived there, or maybe there was a particular game that you played, or there was just some kind of belief. And it can even be something as simple as if you remember things like not stepping on cracks in the pavement because of the rhyme about stepping on a crack and it would break a parent's back and so on. Or if there were certain plants that you knew not to bring into the house, things like that. By all means share those, so I'm interested to see what people remember from their own childhoods. But then if you've noticed children that you know doing, saying, playing, believe in particular things, and it might be quite incomprehensible to you as an adult, but it seems to mean something to them. But again, by all means share that as well, because that obviously is children's folklore at its finest, when it's folklore shared and generated and maintained and essentially kept up by them rather than by adults. So that's what we're going to have a look at in February. And I will let you know now, March is going to be trees again, because it's a while since we've done trees and I know people are fascinated by trees. So that's going to be quite a fun one as well. So if you've got any particular requests, I guess. Bearing in mind, sometimes people will request a treat and then I'm like, oh my god, there actually isn't any folklore about this one. So sometimes I can't include something because there just isn't any folklore. But sometimes they're still really cool ecologically, so you never know, I might include them anyway. But yeah, so children's folklore in February and trees in March. So with that being said, as always, love to everyone in Minnesota. And just basically love to anyone in communities that are having problems at the moment. Like, life is hard enough, and I don't think that we need to make it more difficult for each other, quite frankly. So wishing everyone health, hope and happiness as always, and I will see you next week when we get into some children's folklore. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. I don't get paid per play of the podcast like musicians do, so if you'd like to support the podcast so I can keep it ad-free and help me pay for all the annoying stuff like web hosting and cover the hours it takes me to make these episodes, then you can buy me a coffee on Ko-fi or become a member of the Fabulous Folklore family by becoming a paid supporter on Ko-fi, Patreon and Substack. Or you can leave a review, tell a friend, or share episodes on social media for free. It all helps.